She came as a bride. She arrived as a prisoner. And the man waiting for her at the end of that dirt road was either her salvation or the final lock on her cage. Elena Ashcroft had exactly 48 hours to decide whether to marry a stranger or lose her brothers forever. No court, no appeal, no mercy. Just the cold arithmetic of a guardian who had spent 6 years turning her family's grief into his personal fortune. The wagon wheels ground against dry Texas soil, carrying her toward a ranch she'd never seen, a man she'd never met, and a future that belonged entirely to someone else. If you've ever been trapped by someone who smiled while they destroyed you, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. Hit like if you're already angry on her behalf. Let's begin. The summer Elena Ashcroft turned 20, she learned that some men didn't need to raise their fists to break you. They just needed the right paperwork. Silas Granger had been her guardian for 6 years, ever since her mother, Margaret, collapsed on the kitchen floor of their rented house in Caldwell Creek and never got back up. 6 years of arrangements. 6 years of Silas managing the modest trust her father had left behind, the one that seemed to shrink no matter how careful they were supposed to be. 6 years of him sitting across supper tables and church meetings with that flat, unreadable smile, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. Elena had learned to read that smile the way farmers read storm clouds. It was a Tuesday morning when he called her into the front parlor of his house. His house, though she'd lived in the back rooms for 3 years now, ever since he'd sold the family home to pay off debts, she still didn't fully understand. Her brothers, Thomas and Will, were outside somewhere, 8 and 10 years old respectively, probably throwing rocks at fence posts and pretending it was target practice. "Sit down, Elena." She sat. She'd learned not to argue about small things. It saved her energy for the ones that mattered. Silas set a document on the table between them. It was folded in thirds, the paper thick and official-looking, stamped with a seal she didn't recognize. "You're going to Blackstone Ranch," he said. "The arrangements have already been made." She looked at the paper without touching it. "I don't know what that is." "It's 40 miles northeast. Good land. Profitable." He paused. "Ronan Blackstone is a widower. He needs a wife for practical reasons. His niece needs a woman's presence in the house. And you," he tapped the document, "are 20 years old with no land, no income, no prospects, and 2 small brothers who currently eat at my table." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. She heard each one separately. 20, no land, no income, 2 small brothers. "You're selling me," she said. "I'm arranging a marriage." His voice didn't change. "There's a difference. Is there?" "Elena." He leaned back in his chair, the picture of patience. "I've carried this family for 6 years. Your mother's debts alone." "My mother didn't have debts." The smile. "She had a reputation, which amounts to the same thing in a town like this." He picked up the document and held it toward her. "The boys can stay together. They'll be fed, schooled, cared for. All you have to do is sign." She stared at the paper. "And if I don't?" He set it back down on the table, very carefully, very gently. "Then I contact the county placement office. Thomas goes to the Harwick farm. They need field labor. They don't care much about age. William is small enough that the Caldwell orphanage might still take him." He shrugged, one shoulder, almost apologetic. "I've done everything I can, Elena. I'm just one man." She picked up the pen. Her hand didn't shake. She was proud of that afterward, for a long time. She signed her name in her mother's careful, slanted cursive, the handwriting Margaret had spent years teaching her, and she set the pen down and stood up. "Can I say goodbye to the boys before I go?" "Of course," Silas said. "You're not a prisoner." The wagon left at dawn 2 days later. Elena sat in the back with her travel bag, 1 change of clothes, her mother's Bible, a small tin of hairpins, and a cotton handkerchief with the initials M.A. embroidered in the corner. That was everything. 20 years of living reduced to what she could carry in one arm. The driver was a ranch hand named Pete, a weathered man in his 50s who smelled like wood smoke and didn't talk much. She was grateful for the silence. She'd spent the last 2 nights staring at the ceiling of her room, constructing elaborate mental pictures of what waited at the end of this road. An old man, probably. Heavy-handed. The kind who'd married before and buried his wife and decided to simply acquire another one, the way you'd replace a tool that wore out. She prepared herself for indifference, contempt even. What she hadn't prepared for was the land. 40 miles northeast of Caldwell Creek, the Texas Hill Country opened up like a held breath finally released. The scrub brush gave way to live oak and cedar, and somewhere around mid-morning the road curved along the edge of a valley where a creek ran silver in the summer heat. Cattle grazed in scattered groups across the lower pastures. Fences ran straight as rulers to the horizon. Whatever Silas had said about Ronan Blackstone, the man clearly knew how to work. The main house appeared around a final bend in the road. 2 stories, stone foundation, a wide porch with a wooden rocking chair that someone had left sideways, like they'd stood up in a hurry. A barn stood 50 yards back. 3 horses moved in a paddock to the left. A girl of maybe 7 or 8 sat on the top rail of the paddock fence, watching the wagon approach with the kind of direct, unsettling stare that only children could manage without embarrassment. Pete pulled the wagon to a stop. "We're here, miss." Elena climbed down before he could offer to help. She stood in the dust with her bag and looked at the house and thought, "I live here now. This is what I chose." She repeated it until it felt like something other than a sentence. The front door opened. She'd expected old. She'd expected heavy-handed. She had not expected the man who stepped off that porch, somewhere in his mid-30s, dark-haired, with the kind of deliberate, measured way of moving that suggested he thought before he acted. He was tall without making a performance of it. He wore work clothes, dusty at the knees, and he carried a battered hat in one hand that he turned over twice before stopping at the foot of the porch steps. He looked at her, not through her, not past her, at her. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. His voice was quieter than she expected. "Mr. Blackstone." A pause stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but honest. He wasn't pretending this was a normal meeting between normal people. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. "Pete take good care of you on the road?" "Yes, sir." "You eat this morning?" She hadn't. She'd been too tight in the stomach to manage more than half a cup of coffee. "I'm fine." He didn't push it. He glanced at the girl on the fence rail who had not moved and was still watching. "That's Clara, she's 7. She doesn't warm up fast, but she's not rude, she's just cautious. You'll understand it better once you know her history." He looked back at Elena. "I expect you're cautious too." "I am," she said, because it was true and lying seemed like a poor way to begin. Something in his face shifted, almost like relief. "Good. That's good." He cleared his throat. "I have some things to explain to you before we go inside. Things I should have put in writing beforehand, but I wasn't sure how to say them." She waited. He turned the hat over one more time. "I know what Granger told you about this arrangement. I'm guessing he made it sound like you had no choice, and I'm guessing that's mostly true, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He looked at her directly again. "But I want you to understand something. I didn't send for you because I wanted a servant, or because I wanted someone to warm a bed. Clara needs stability. I need help managing this house, but what I need does not override what you're owed as a person." He paused. "You'll have your own room. You'll have a say in how this house is run, and if after a year you want to leave, I'll give you enough money to go somewhere Granger can't reach you." She stared at him. "That's not what I was told to expect," she said finally. "I know." He finally put the hat back on his head, a gesture that somehow ended the formal part of the conversation. "Come inside. I'll have Rosa put something on the stove." Rosa turned out to be Rosa Medina, who was 63 years old, 4'11", and apparently terrified of absolutely nothing on earth. She ran the Blackstone kitchen with the quiet authority of a woman who had fed ranch hands for 40 years and had strong opinions about everything from biscuit ratios to the correct way to hang laundry. She looked Elena over once, sharp and fast, and then nodded like she'd reached a conclusion. "You're thin," she said. "Sit." Elena sat. She ate 2 biscuits and a bowl of beef broth and a cup of coffee so strong it made her eyes water, and Rosa stood at the counter and watched without speaking, which was somehow not unkind. Clara appeared in the doorway midway through the meal and stood there with her arms crossed, still doing the staring thing. "You can come in," Elena said. "I know I can," Clara said. She didn't move. "She's deciding," Rosa said without turning around. "She'll let you know when she's decided." After breakfast, Ronan showed her the house, matter-of-factly, the way you'd show a person the tools they'd be working with. The kitchen, the sitting room, the narrow staircase, The 2 bedrooms on the upper floor. He opened a door at the end of the hall. This one's yours. It was small. A single bed with a quilt in blue and cream, a window that looked out over the east pasture, a 3-drawer chest and a wooden chair, a braided rug on the floor that was starting to fray at one edge. It was the first room she'd had entirely to herself in 3 years. It's fine, she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. I'll have Pete bring in another lamp if you need it. This is fine, she said again. She sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands flat against her thighs, because that was the only way she could think of to stop them from shaking, and she looked out the window at the pasture and the oak trees bending in the afternoon wind, and she did not cry. She was not going to cry in front of a man she'd met 4 hours ago. Ronan Blackstone, to his credit, pretended not to notice any of it. He simply said, "Supper's at 6, and pulled the door shut behind him and gave her the only thing she hadn't known she needed. 20 minutes alone. The first week passed like a cautious negotiation between two people learning each other's rhythms without wanting to admit they were doing it. Elena woke before dawn each morning. She'd always been an early riser, a habit built by necessity rather than nature. She helped Rosa in the kitchen. She learned where the water buckets were kept, which boards on the porch were loose, how Clara liked her eggs, scrambled, never runny, always with a pinch of pepper that Rosa said was too much pepper for a 7-year-old, but was a battle Rosa had chosen to stop fighting. Ronan was out by sunrise and didn't return until near dark. He wasn't avoiding her. It was simply the pace of the ranch, the relentless work of managing cattle and fences and hay stores and everything else that Blackstone Ranch demanded of the man who ran it. When he came in at supper, he was tired in the way physical work makes a person tired, quietly, completely, without drama. They ate together at the kitchen table. Rosa joined them. Clara sat between Elena and Rosa and ate her properly scrambled eggs and watched everything with those careful eyes. The conversations were careful too at first. Weather, the condition of the east pasture, whether the roof over the second barn needed repair before the August rains. "Do you ride?" Ronan asked one evening near the end of the first week. "I used to," Elena said. "Before—" She stopped. "Some. Not recently. There's a mare in the paddock, gray, named Sage. She's gentle. Clara rides her." He spooned more stew. "You could use her if you wanted. No obligation." Clara looked up from her plate. "Sage doesn't like strangers usually." "She liked you," Elena pointed out. "I'm not a stranger," Clara said, with perfect 7-year-old logic. "And anyway, I fed her apples for 2 weeks before she let me on her back." "That's a good strategy," Elena said. "Slow and patient." Clara looked at her for a moment with that measuring stare. Then she went back to her stew. It wasn't warmth, it wasn't trust, but it was something. On the 9th day, Elena found the veil. She was helping Rosa sort through the cedar chest in the upstairs hallway. It needed airing out, Rosa said, and Elena understood this was Rosa's way of giving her something to do with her hands, while her mind worked through the strangeness of being somewhere new. The chest held linens, a pair of winter curtains, a child's blanket in faded yellow, and at the very bottom, wrapped in brown paper, a bridal veil. The fabric was ivory, fine as breath, with a border of blue embroidery along the hem. Small, careful stitches that someone had clearly spent many hours on. A few of the threads were coming loose near one end, unraveling where the fabric had been folded the same way for too long. Rosa appeared in the doorway, saw what Elena was holding. Her face went through something complicated before settling into stillness. "That was Catherine's," she said. Elena waited. "Ronan's sister. She died 4 years back just before Clara was born. Clara's mother." Rosa crossed her arms over her chest, the gesture of someone holding something in. "She made that herself. 6 months it took her. Catherine was the kind of woman who did everything thoroughly or not at all." A pause. "She never got to wear it." Elena looked down at the veil again, at the blue stitches, patient and precise. "What happened to Clara's father?" "Left," Rosa said simply, "before the baby came. Some men are like that." Elena set the veil on her lap and looked at the unraveling threads. "Could I fix this?" Rosa studied her for a moment. "You sew?" "My mother taught me." She ran her thumb carefully along the fraying edge. "Blue thread like this. Do you have any?" Rosa looked at her for another moment, the way she looked at most things, as if she were calculating whether they were worth the bother. Then she unfolded her arms. "Come downstairs," she said. "I'll show you the sewing box." Ronan found her that evening on the porch, working on the veil by the last of the daylight. He stopped at the door, and she looked up, and something moved through his face that she couldn't name, a complicated country between pain and something softer. "Rosa told me you found it," he said. "I'm sorry, I should have asked before I—" "No." He shook his head, came and sat on the porch steps a few feet from her chair. He looked out at the paddock rather than at her hands. "It's been in that chest for 4 years. Catherine would have hated knowing it was in there getting worse." Elena tied off a stitch, found the next loose thread. "She sounds like someone who minded about things." "She did." A pause. "In the good way. She cared about—" He stopped, started over. "When she was 12, she spent a whole winter teaching herself to braid rope because someone told her girls couldn't do it right. By spring, she could do it faster than any of the boys." A rough sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She would have hated Silas Granger. Elena's hands went still for just a moment. She had good instincts about men like that, Ronan said. She would have clocked him in the first 5 minutes. "I should have," Elena said quietly. "No." His voice went flat with certainty. "You were 14 when your mother died. You were alone with 2 small children and a man who controlled your options. That's not failure of instinct. That's just a position no one should have been in." She looked at him. He was still looking at the paddock. "You know about my mother," she said. "I know what Granger told the arrangement broker, which means I know the version he wanted me to hear." He glanced at her. "I'd like to know the real one. When you're ready. No pressure." She went back to the stitch in her hands, pulled the thread through, even, careful, the way her mother had shown her. "Her name was Margaret," she said. And then slowly, with many stops and the particular difficulty of saying true things out loud for the first time, she began to tell him. The porch grew dark around them. Rosa brought out a lamp without being asked and set it on the rail and went back inside. Claire's light went out upstairs. The cattle settled in the lower pasture. Elena talked until the veil was folded in her lap and the thread was used up, and her voice had gone a little rough at the edges, and Ronan Blackstone sat on the porch steps and listened. Not with the face of someone waiting for his turn to speak, but with the face of someone who understood that being heard was sometimes the most necessary thing a person could receive. When she finished, he didn't say anything right away. Then, "I'm going to look into something about the church records." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "You said the debt was from a charity fund, church charity." He looked at her steadily. "Those have records, ledgers. I know Elder Marsh. He's kept every document that ever passed through that building since 1871. If your mother repaid what Granger claims she stole, there'd be an entry." Elena felt something strange move through her chest, something fragile and dangerous that she'd trained herself not to feel. "What if there isn't?" "Then we'll know that too," Ronan said. "But you said your mother wasn't a thief." "She wasn't." "Then let's find out what she was." He stood up, picked up his hat from the step beside him, and went inside. The screen door swung shut behind him. Elena sat in the lamplight for a long time, holding her mother's Bible against her chest and listening to the night sounds of a ranch that was slowly, cautiously, beginning to feel like something she wasn't entirely sure she could name. Not home. Not yet. But possibly the direction of it. 3 weeks into her life at Blackstone Ranch, Elena stopped flinching every time a door opened. She hadn't realized she'd been doing it until Rosa pointed it out. Not unkindly, just with the directness that seemed to be Rosa's primary mode of human communication. They'd been folding laundry on the back porch when the barn door swung open in the wind and cracked against the frame, and Elena's hands went still, and her shoulders came up before she could stop them. Rosa looked at her for a moment, then she went back to folding a pillowcase. "He doesn't slam doors," she said. "Ronan never has, even when he's angry. Walks heavy, but he doesn't slam things." Elena smoothed out a crease in the sheet she was holding. "I know that." "Your body doesn't yet," Rosa said simply. And that was the end of it. She was right, though. There was a difference between knowing something in your mind and having it settle into your bones, and Elena had spent 6 years developing reflexes that had been perfectly reasonable under Silas Granger's roof and were now simply a habit she was slowly having to unlearn. The way she calculated exits when she entered a room. The way she kept her voice level and her answers short when a conversation felt like it was moving towards something she couldn't predict. The way she always made sure she knew where Thomas and Will were, even now, even 40 miles away, as if proximity had ever actually been the thing that kept them safe. She wrote to them twice a week. Silas allowed it. Letters, supervised, read before they were sent. She wrote about the ranch, about Clara, about Rosa's opinions on biscuit flour. She wrote carefully, the way you write when you know someone else is reading, keeping the warmth in and the despair out. She didn't know if Thomas and Will read between the lines. She hoped they did. She hoped they didn't. The veil took her 9 days to repair properly. She worked on it in the evenings, after supper, by the lamp on the kitchen table when Rosa had gone to bed and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds. The creak of the upper stairs, the wind off the pasture, the occasional knock of something loose on the roof of the second barn that Ronan kept saying he'd fix and hadn't gotten to yet. She worked slowly, matching the blue thread as closely as she could to Catherine's original stitching, trying to make the repair invisible rather than decorative, trying to make it look like the damage had never happened. On the fourth evening, Clara came downstairs. Elena looked up. Clara stood at the bottom of the stairs in her nightgown, dark-haired and serious, holding the railing with both hands. "You're still up," she said, as if this were a mild personal failing. "So are you." Clara considered this. "I couldn't sleep." She came and sat in the chair across the table, pulling her feet up under her. She looked at the veil in Elena's hands. "Is that my mama's?" "Yes." "Rosa said you were fixing it." She was quiet for a moment. "She said my mama made it herself." "That's what Rosa told me." Clara picked at a thread on her nightgown hem. "I don't remember her. I was a baby." Pause. "Uncle Ronan says she was funny. He says she laughed too loud for church." She glanced up. "We don't go to church anymore." "That's all right." "He says she would have liked you." Clara said it quickly, like she was getting something out before she could think better of it. Then she looked away. "I don't know if I like you yet." "I know," Elena said. "That's fair. I liked my last teacher, but she moved to San Antonio and didn't say goodbye to me personally, which I thought was rude." She said it with the particular dignity of a 7-year-old who had considered this grievance carefully. "So I'm not in a hurry anymore." "About what?" "About deciding on people." Elena went back to her stitch. "That's probably smart," she said. They sat in the kitchen together for another half hour without saying much else. At some point, Clara put her head down on the table and fell asleep, and Elena finished the row she was working on and then sat looking at this small girl and the way her breathing had gone deep and even, and she felt something move through her that she didn't have a clean name for, something adjacent to tenderness and also adjacent to grief, the particular ache of caring about someone you're not sure you have the right to care about yet. She got up and put her shawl over Clara's shoulders and went to bed. The next morning, Clara ate her scrambled eggs without her usual commentary and handed Elena the pepper without being asked. It wasn't much, but Elena was beginning to understand that at Blackstone Ranch, small things were how the real things got said. Ronan rode out to Caldwell Creek on a Wednesday, 2.5 weeks after Elena had told him about her mother. He didn't make an announcement about it. He simply said at breakfast that he had business in town and would be back before dark. And he said it the same way he said everything, plainly, without decoration. He came back at dusk with his jaw set in a way Elena was beginning to recognize. He unsaddled his horse, came inside, washed his hands at the pump, and sat down at the kitchen table with the expression of a man who had found something he wasn't sure he wanted to have found. Rosa set a plate in front of him. He didn't touch it. "I talked to Elder Marsh," he said. Elena sat across from him. Clara was already in bed. Rosa leaned against the counter with her arms crossed, which was her listening posture. "He remembers the Ashcroft situation," Ronan said. He was careful about how he said it. You know how Marsh gets when he thinks he's said something he shouldn't have. But he remembers. He said the donation records from that period are in storage boxes under the vestry. He said... He stopped, picked up his fork, put it down again. He said he'd always thought the accounting was odd. That was his word, odd. Elena's hands were flat on the table. She could feel her own pulse in her palms. "Did you see the records?" "He wouldn't let me into the storage boxes without more cause." "That's fair." They're not mine to look through. He looked at her. But he said something else. He said that about 8 years ago, a donation came in that was significantly larger than usual, earmarked specifically as repayment of an outstanding debt. He said whoever processed it that week marked it under general fund rather than tracking it to the original account. He paused. He said he didn't know why. The kitchen was very quiet. My mother paid it back, Elena said. The words felt strange in her mouth, like something she'd been holding so long she'd forgotten the shape of it. She told me she did. She told me every cent. I believe you, Ronan said. Silas said, I know what Silas said. His voice was even, but not soft. Silas told half this county that your mother embezzled charity money and died before she could make it right. He's been the wrong party in that story for 6 years. He finally picked up his fork, more for something to do with his hands than out of hunger. If that donation was misrouted deliberately, if someone made sure it never got properly credited, then the debt was never officially cleared, Elena said slowly, and he could keep claiming it existed. And use it to control you, Rosa said from the counter. She said it quietly, without dramatics, which somehow made it worse. Elena stared at the table. The lamp between them threw soft shadows across the wood grain, and she sat in them and thought about her mother. About Margaret Ashcroft, who had been so careful about everything, so scrupulous, who had cried for 3 days when the accusation started, and spent months afterward trying to prove something to a town that had already made up its mind, who had gotten sick the following winter with a tiredness that hadn't lifted, who had faded the way some people faded when the thing they were fighting stopped being winnable. I need to see those records, Elena said. Yes, Ronan said. We need cause to ask for them officially, something concrete. He set down his fork again. I'm going to write to the county land office. Granger has managed your family's finances for 6 years through a guardianship arrangement. If there are discrepancies between what he's claimed and what the church records show, that's a matter that goes beyond a family dispute. He looked at her steadily. But Elena, this is going to make him angry. If he finds out we're looking, he'll tighten his hold on the boys, she said. Yes. She nodded once. She'd already known that. She'd known it the moment she heard the word odd from Ronan's mouth. Known it the way you know a storm is coming, not because you can see it, but because the air has changed. Then we have to be careful about how we move. Yes. They looked at each other across the table, and something settled between them in that moment. Not an agreement exactly, but a mutual recognition of what they were both now standing inside of. It wasn't a comfortable thing to stand inside of. But there was, Elena thought, something almost steadying about not being in it alone. Rosa pushed off from the counter. Eat your supper, she said to Ronan, before it goes cold and I have to hear about it. And because Rosa's opinions on wasted food were apparently one of the organizing principles of Blackstone Ranch, he picked up his fork and ate. The letter Silas sent arrived on a Friday. It came with the regular post, tucked between a supply invoice and a ranching circular, her name written on the outside in Silas's handwriting. That precise, controlled script that always looked more like a legal document than personal correspondence. She opened it in the kitchen while Rosa was outside with Clara, and she read it standing up because something in her didn't want to be sitting down for whatever it said. It was short, 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph asked after her health, and hoped she was finding her situation satisfactory. The second mentioned that Thomas had developed a summer cold but was recovering well, and that William had broken a fence slat during what Silas called some unsupervised roughhousing, which had required a discussion about responsibility. The third paragraph noted, in the same even, pleasant tone as the rest, that he'd heard Ronan Blackstone had been in Caldwell Creek asking questions of certain community members, and that he hoped there was no misunderstanding about the terms of the current arrangement, and that he remained committed to the welfare of both boys as long as all parties continued to fulfill their obligations. Elena read the third paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter and set it on the table. He knew. Maybe not the specifics, but he knew Ronan had been asking. 6 years of managing this county had given Silas a network of ears, merchants, church members, people who owed him favors or feared him quietly. It had taken him less than 2 weeks. She was still standing there when Ronan came in from the east pasture, pulling off his gloves. He read her face before he read the letter. What happened? She handed him the paper. He read it, set it down. He's warning us off. He's reminding me what he holds, she said. There's a difference. He's not threatening outright. He never does anything outright. He just, she stopped, made herself breathe. He mentioned Will broke a fence slat. Will breaks things constantly. It's practically a personality trait, but Silas mentioned it specifically because he knew I'd understand. Ronan's jaw was doing the thing again. He put his hand on an 8-year-old in a letter to his sister. He put a fact in a letter and let me fill in the rest. She sat down now because her legs had gone unreliable. That's how he's always done it. Nothing you can point to, nothing that sounds wrong when you say it out loud. Ronan pulled out the chair across from her and sat. Then we stopped moving slow, he said. What do you mean? I mean, I've been trying to build a careful case, document by document, which is the right way to do it legally, but it gives him time. He looked at her. The community gathering is in 6 weeks. Every family in 3 counties comes in for it. It's the only time of year you get Elder Marsh and the county recorder and half the town leadership in the same place at the same time. His voice was even, measured. The voice of a man thinking through something he'd already half decided. If we can get access to those church records before then, if we can show what we find to the right people at the right moment. He'll deny it, Elena said immediately. Whatever we find, he'll have an explanation. He's had years to build explanations. I know. The town believes him. They've believed him for 6 years. My mother spent months trying to... She stopped herself, pressed her hands flat on the table again, that habit she couldn't seem to break. People don't like being told they believe the wrong person. It makes them angry, and that anger doesn't always go where it belongs. No, Ronan said, it doesn't. He was quiet for a moment. But there's a difference between one woman's word and a ledger. Paper with dates and figures doesn't ask people to choose sides the same way. He looked at her. I'm not saying it's going to be clean. It's not going to be clean. But if we do nothing, if we back off because he scared us with a letter, I know, she said quietly. I know that too. Outside, she could hear Clara's voice and Rosa's lower one, some small argument about something she couldn't make out from here. The ordinary afternoon sound of the ranch, continuing without drama, indifferent to everything happening at this kitchen table. 6 years. She thought about 6 years of letters read before they were sent, of conversations calculated for Silas's consumption, of making herself small enough to be allowed to keep what little she had. She thought about Thomas with his summer cold and Will with his fence slat and her mother's careful handwriting in the Bible she kept on the nightstand upstairs. What do you need from me? She asked. I need you to write to Elder Marsh yourself, Ronan said, in your own name, asking to see the records as your mother's surviving next of kin. I can back the request officially, but it should come from you first. It has to come from you. He might tell Silas. He might. We move fast after, either way. She sat with it. The particular weight of a decision that, once made, couldn't be unmade. The door that once opened couldn't be closed again. All right, she said. She wrote the letter that evening at the same kitchen table where she repaired Catherine's veil, by the same lamp. Rosa brought her tea she didn't ask for and didn't make any comment about it. Clara had come downstairs again. It was becoming a habit, apparently, this nighttime quiet between them, and she sat in her chair and did not ask what Elena was writing and instead told her at length about a hawk she'd seen that afternoon sitting on the fence post by the water trough, which she'd apparently found personally significant. He just sat there, Clara said, for a really long time, just watching. Hawks do that, Elena said, not looking up from the letter. Rosa said hawks are patient because they know what they're waiting for. A pause. Are you patient? Elena thought about the last 6 years, about every calculation, every careful word, every letter written for Silas's eyes, about standing in that parlor with a pen in her hand, watching her own future being signed away while her brothers played outside. I've had practice, she said. Clara seemed to find this satisfactory. She put her head on her arms on the table and watched Elena write until her eyes drifted shut, and Elena finished the letter and set down her pen and looked at the child sleeping across from her, and then at the mended veil folded neatly in its brown paper at the edge of the table, the blue stitches holding fast, the damage invisible now to anyone who hadn't known to look. She sealed the letter. The next morning, Ronan rode to town to post it before Elena could change her mind, which she hadn't told him she was considering, but which he apparently understood anyway. The way he had begun to understand a number of things about her that she hadn't explicitly said. She stood on the porch and watched him go and felt the letter leave with him like something physical. A stone lifted, and the cold air beneath it. What came next would come. She had learned, slowly, painfully, across the weeks of this strange new life, that you could not control what Silas Granger did with information or with people. You could only decide what you were going to do when he moved. She went inside and helped Rosa with the bread dough and listened to Clara recite her morning lessons and didn't allow herself to think too far ahead. One thing at a time. That was all anyone could manage. But that night, for the first time since she'd arrived at Blackstone Ranch, she dreamed about her mother. Not the sick, fading version, not the woman whittled down by shame and exhaustion, but the earlier one. Margaret Ashcroft at the kitchen table of their own house, before everything, head bent over some piece of mending, humming something tuneless and slightly off-key, completely at ease in her own skin. Elena woke up and lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her. And for a few minutes, before the day came back with all its weight, she let herself hold that image of her mother and think, "We are going to find out what happened to you. One way or another. I promise we're going to find out." Then she got up because dawn was coming and there was bread to finish and eggs to scramble with exactly the right amount of pepper, and the ordinary machinery of the day didn't stop for grief or hope or anything else. She went downstairs. Elder Marsh's reply came 11 days after Elena's letter left the ranch. It was not a warm letter, but it was an honest one, which Elena had come to understand were often different things. The elder wrote in his careful, cramped hand that he had located the relevant storage boxes from the period in question, that he had reviewed several of the donation ledgers himself as a matter of his own conscience, and that he believed there were entries that warranted a closer examination by the appropriate parties. He wrote that he could not, in good conscience, allow the records to be removed from the vestry, but that he would permit Elena and one other adult representative to review them in person, at a time of his choosing, before the annual community gathering. He wrote one more thing at the bottom, separated from the rest by a line of blank space, as if he'd added it after consideration and hadn't quite decided whether to include it. It said, "I knew your mother, Miss Ashcroft. She was a woman of considerable integrity. I should have said so publicly, years ago. I regret that I did not." Elena read that last part 3 times. Then she folded the letter very precisely along its original creases and put it inside her mother's Bible, between the pages where she'd already placed the cotton handkerchief with the embroidered initials. And she sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the window and the east pasture beyond it for a long time without moving. Ronan knocked on the door frame. He'd learned early on not to come fully into her room uninvited. Another thing she hadn't explicitly asked for, and he'd understood without being told. Good or bad? "He'll let us see the records," she said. He came to the doorway properly then, read her face. "What else?" She handed him the letter. He read it. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something moved through it, a tightening, then a slow release. He handed it back. "He's been carrying that a while." 6 years at least, she said. Longer, maybe. She stood up because sitting still had stopped feeling possible. He knew her. He watched what happened to her reputation, and he said nothing. And now he wants to give me a letter. "Yes. I'm not—" She stopped. She wasn't going to stand here and perform righteous anger for Ronan Blackstone, who hadn't done anything wrong. "I know he's trying to help now. I understand that." She moved to the window, looked out at the pasture where Sage was grazing in the morning shade of the oak trees. "It's just that now is a long time after it mattered." "It still matters," Ronan said. "What he found in those boxes? That still matters." "I know." She pressed her fingertips to the window glass, cool against the July heat already building outside. "When does he want us to come?" "I'll write back today. We'll make it as soon as he'll agree to." She nodded. Then, "Ronan," she turned from the window, "if we find what I think we're going to find, if it's there in the ledger, clear enough to show people, what happens to Silas?" He was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he was considering how much of it to say. She was learning to read the difference. The legal side is complicated, he said finally. Manipulating donation records, misrepresenting a debt. There are laws, but enforcing them means a county proceeding, means witnesses, means Silas hiring a lawyer and making it ugly before it gets resolved. He paused. But the community gathering is in 3 weeks, and in this part of Texas there are things that matter more than what a court does. She understood him. A man standing in a community like Caldwell Creek wasn't just reputation. It was the sum of every favor owed, every debt of trust, every handshake deal that held because both men's words were considered good. Silas Granger had built his influence the same way he'd built everything, carefully, over years, making himself necessary to enough people that challenging him felt like challenging the structure itself. Show enough of those people the truth, clearly enough in the right moment, and the structure could come apart faster than any court proceeding. He's going to know we're moving, she said. He already knows something's happening. 3 weeks is enough time for him to prepare his side of it, yes. Ronan's jaw set. Which is why we need to be very careful between now and the gathering about who we talk to and what we say. No conversations in town, nothing in writing that goes through anyone who might be connected to him. He looked at her steadily. Can you keep writing your regular letters to the boys? Same as always? Nothing different, nothing that would signal, I've been writing careful letters for 6 years, Elena said. I know how to do that. Something in his face softened slightly. I know you do. She went back to the window. The morning was heating up fast. The sky that particular pale Texas blue that meant no clouds and no relief until sundown. I want to go with you when you see Elder Marsh, she said. I know you said one other adult, but I need to be in that room. I need to see it myself. I know, he said. I'd already planned on it. She nodded. It was not lost on her the way he'd said I'd already planned on it, as if her presence in the room where her mother's name might be cleared was such an obvious thing it hadn't required discussion. She was not accustomed to that, to being considered as a matter of course rather than as an afterthought. Thank you, she said. He shook his head once, that slight dismissive gesture he made when he thought someone was thanking him for something that didn't require thanks. Then he left to write to Elder Marsh, and Elena stood at her window a little longer, watching Sage move slowly through the grass, and thought about her mother's name, and about what it would feel like to say it in a room where people had to believe her. She was afraid to want it too badly. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. The more desperately you needed something, the more room there was for it to break you when it didn't come. So she kept it carefully contained, that fragile thing inside her chest, and went downstairs to help with breakfast, and did not let herself think too far ahead. Clara was already at the table, mid-argument with Rosa about whether the hawk she'd seen yesterday and the hawk she'd seen today were the same hawk or two, different ones. Rosa's position was that hawks were territorial, and it was almost certainly the same bird. Clara's position was that Rosa couldn't possibly know that and was just guessing. The argument was proceeding with considerable passion from both sides, and Elena sat down in her chair and poured herself coffee and let it wash over her, and felt something she could only describe as the particular comfort of ordinary things. The following week, a writer came from town. Elena was in the garden, an untidy patch behind the house where Rosa grew tomatoes and herbs and had recently declared war on a family of rabbits who were apparently not respecting the boundary established by the wire fencing. Elena was pulling weeds from the tomato rows, not because anyone had asked her to, but because it was the kind of mindless physical work that let her thoughts run without needing to perform anything. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, and she stood up and shaded her eyes and watched a man she didn't recognize come up the main road at a pace that suggested urgency without quite being a gallop. He pulled up at the front of the house and called out for Ronan, and Pete emerged from the barn and pointed toward the east pasture. She went around to the front. The rider was a young man, maybe 18, with a hired hand look about him and a sealed envelope in his coat pocket. He glanced at her with the brief, impersonal assessment of someone who was there on business and not social call. "Ma'am, I've got something for Mr. Blackstone." "He's in the east pasture. Pete can take you out." She paused. "Who sent you?" The young man hesitated. "Mr. Granger's office, ma'am." The words landed like cold water. She kept her face where it was. "Thank you," she said evenly, and walked back around the house and went into the kitchen and stood at the counter with her hands braced against the edge of it, breathing slowly. Rosa came in from the pantry, took one look at her, and didn't ask. Ronan came back 20 minutes later. He had the letter in his hand and the jaw-set expression, but underneath it was something else. Something that looked almost like carefully controlled contempt. "He's proposing a meeting," Ronan said. "Just the two of us, before the gathering." He tossed the letter on the table. "He says he understands there may be some confusion about the nature of the financial arrangements between our families, and he'd like to clarify matters in a spirit of mutual cooperation." Elena looked at the letter without touching it. "He wants to know what you know." "Yes. And he wants to offer you something, to drop it." "Almost certainly." Ronan pulled out the chair and sat. "He'll be careful about how he phrases it. Something that sounds like generosity, releasing the boys from the guardianship arrangement early, maybe, or some adjustment to the financial terms." He looked at her. He's done this before, with other people who got too close to something he'd buried, offer them just enough to make the problem go away. "And people take it," Elena said. "Sometimes. It's hard to say no to the thing you want most when someone's holding it in front of you." He was watching her steadily. "He's going to offer you the boys, Elena. Not directly, not in writing, but that's what he's going to put on the table, because he knows that's the one thing that could make you stop." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. The kitchen was warm, the morning light coming through the window at a low angle, and somewhere outside Clara was talking to the chickens with the earnest, detailed monologue she reserved for animals, and apparently believed they appreciated. "Don't go," Elena said. "I wasn't going to." "I know, She flattened her hands on the table. "I needed to say it." "He'll escalate after I don't respond," Ronan said. "We have to be ready for that." "What does escalating look like for him?" "Public pressure. He'll start talking before we do, getting his version of things out to the right people before the gathering, making sure that when the records come out, there's already a framework people are using to understand them." Ronan's voice was even and analytical, but she could hear the edge underneath it. "He'll go after you, directly, personally. He's been careful up until now because he thought this would go away, but if he realizes we have Marsh, that we're going into that vestry..." He stopped. "He'll try to make this about your character before it can be about his." She thought about that, about standing in front of a town that had spent 6 years believing Silas Granger's account of her mother's disgrace, and now being asked to believe something different. About the specific kind of cruelty that was available to a man who knew every weak point in the story you'd been trying to survive. "Let him," she said. Ronan looked at her. "I mean it." Her voice was steadier than she expected. "If he wants to stand up and say those things about my mother, about me, in front of the whole community, let him. Because the only reason to be afraid of him saying it is if we don't have the thing that proves him wrong." She looked at Ronan. "But we're going to have it. We're going to walk out of that vestry with it in our hands, so let him talk." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this." "I've been thinking about this since I was 14 years old," she said. "I just didn't think I'd ever be in a position to do anything but keep my head down and take it." They rode into Caldwell Creek on a Thursday morning, 10 days before the gathering, with Pete driving the wagon and Elena sitting up front in her second-best dress because she'd ruined the good one pulling up fence posts the previous week and hadn't had time to properly mend it. Elder Marsh was waiting for them at the side entrance to the vestry, a small, gray-haired man in his 70s with the slightly stooped posture of someone who'd spent decades bent over books and ledgers. He shook Ronan's hand and then Elena's, and held her hand a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and looked at her with an expression she recognized as guilt, wearing the clothes of kindness. She didn't hold it against him. Guilt, in her experience, was at least honest about what it was. The vestry was cool and dim, smelling of old paper and cedar. The wooden shelves along the walls stacked with boxes in various states of organization. Elder Marsh led them to a table where 4 ledger books were already laid out, open to specific pages marked with strips of paper. "I've been through most of this myself over the past 2 weeks," he said. "I want to be straightforward with you about what I found, because I think you deserve that." He put his hand on the first ledger. "This covers the period when the original complaint was made against your mother. The entry showing the deficit in the charity fund. It's here, dated correctly, everything in order on the surface." He turned to the second ledger, a thinner book with a water-damaged cover. "This is the general fund register for the same period, and here," he pointed to an entry midway down a page, is a donation received approximately 4 months after the deficit was recorded. Substantial amount, earmarked in the margin as charity fund repayment. He paused, but it was entered under general donations, not credited back to the specific fund account. Elena leaned over the table. Her mother's name was not in the entry. It was simply a cash donation, no donor recorded. But the amount matched, and the date, and the marginal notation was there in faded pencil. CF Repay, M.A. Her mother's initials. She put her finger next to the letters without touching them, as if the paper were something that might disappear. "Who made this entry?" Ronan asked. "The handwriting is Marcus Webb's," Elder Marsh said. "He was our record keeper at the time. He passed away 2 years ago." A pause that carried weight. But this, he moved to the third ledger, is where it becomes something beyond a clerical error. The third ledger was a account summary, the kind that would have been reviewed by the Elder Board annually. Elena could see immediately that the charity fund balance in the summary did not reflect the repayment. The deficit remained on record, uncorrected, year after year, while the repayment sat buried in the general fund with only the faint pencil notation in the thinner ledger to indicate what it actually was. "Someone would have had to know both ledgers," Ronan said, "to know the repayment came in and deliberately leave the deficit on the official summary." "Yes," Elder Marsh said. "Webb?" Elena said. Her voice came out quiet. "You said Webb entered it under general donations. Did he have a relationship with Silas Granger?" Elder Marsh folded his hands. Marcus Webb's farm was mortgaged. He had significant debt. That debt was cleared approximately 6 months after this entry was made. He paused. "I cannot make the connection official without more documentation. But it's there," Ronan said. "It's there." The old man looked at Elena. "I should have looked at all of this years ago. I had the authority to conduct a full review at any time, and He stopped. "I accepted what I was told. That is my failure, and I own it." Elena looked at her mother's initials in faded pencil on the page of an old ledger. M.A. Margaret Ashcroft, who had repaid every cent of a debt she'd never actually owed, who had done the right thing without anyone watching, without any guarantee of credit, because that was simply who she was. "Can these come to the gathering?" Elena asked. "The ledgers. I'll bring them myself," Elder Marsh said. "I'll present them personally, if you'll allow me that. It's the least I can do." He looked directly at her. "Your mother deserved better from this community. I intend to say that clearly and on record." They left the vestry an hour later with nothing in their hands but the knowledge of what was in those pages, which was somehow heavier than any physical object. Pete was waiting with the wagon. The main street of Caldwell Creek moved around them in its normal Thursday rhythm. Women at the dry goods store, a few men outside the feed warehouse, a dog sleeping in the strip of shade alongside the barber shop. Normal. Entirely, infuriatingly normal. A town going about its business above the buried thing that was about to surface and rearrange everything. She climbed up to the wagon seat and sat with her hands in her lap. Ronan swung up beside her. Pete clicked to the horses and they began moving. Neither of them spoke for the first mile out of town. Then Elena said, "She did it. She paid it back. She told me she did, and she did." "Yes," Ronan said. "She spent the rest of her life ashamed of something she actually fixed." The words came out flat and factual because that was the only way she could say them without losing hold of herself. She was sick, and she was tired, and she was ashamed of something that wasn't even true, and she stopped, pressed her lips together, looked at the road ahead. Ronan didn't say anything. He didn't offer a platitude or a reassurance or any of the things that people said when they didn't know what else to do. He just sat beside her on the wagon bench, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and let the silence be what it was. After a while, she said, 10 days. 10 days, he agreed. The wagon rolled on through the summer heat, and Elena kept her eyes on the road and her hands folded in her lap, and let herself feel what she needed to feel without apology. The grief, the fury, the particular cold rage of someone who had finally found proof of a thing they'd known for years and had been made to doubt. And underneath all of it, fragile and insistent and almost frightening in its persistence, hope. She'd carried it so long without feeding it that she'd half believed it had died. But it hadn't. It was still there. That stubborn, persistent thing, alive in spite of everything. 10 days. The 10 days before the gathering passed, the way time passes before something you've been afraid of for years finally arrives. Both too fast and with a strange, suspended quality, as if each hour were slightly more real than the ones before it. Silas sent no more letters. That silence was worse than the letters. Ronan recognized it for what it was. A man who stopped sending warnings had stopped warning. He was doing something else now, something quieter and more deliberate, and the not knowing what it was sat at the kitchen table with them every evening like an uninvited guest they'd all agreed not to acknowledge. Rosa cooked. Clara did her lessons. The ranch ran its daily rhythms, and underneath all of it, that particular tight-wound waiting that comes before a thing that can't be taken back. Elena spent the 10 days working, not because there was more work than usual. There wasn't. But because her hands needed to be occupied or her mind would run ahead of her to places she couldn't afford to go yet. She fixed the roof leak over the second barn that Ronan had been meaning to get to, standing on the ladder with Pete handing up shingles and neither of them discussing why she was suddenly interested in roof repair. She reorganized the pantry shelves. She taught Clara to darn socks, which Clara found deeply boring but submitted to with the resigned practicality of a child who had learned that Rosa's requirements for useful life skills were non-negotiable. On the 7th evening, she took the mended veil out of its brown paper and held it up to the lamp. She'd finished the repairs weeks ago, but she'd been looking at it again lately, touching the blue stitches in the particular way you touch something when you're thinking about something else. The repair was good. She'd matched the thread as closely as she could, kept the tension even, made each stitch follow Catherine's original pattern. You could see it, if you knew exactly where to look, the faint difference in thread saturation where new met old. But you had to know where to look. Ronan appeared in this kitchen doorway. He did that. Appeared in doorways, leaning against the frame, as if he were always slightly uncertain whether his presence was wanted and had decided to leave it up to the room to decide. "You've been staring at that veil for 20 minutes, he said. "I've been thinking." "I know." He came in, sat at the table, poured himself a cup of what had been coffee 4 hours ago and was now something more geological. "About tomorrow. About all of it." She set the veil down carefully. "About what happens if it doesn't go the way we're planning. Then we find another way." "Ronan." She looked at him. "I need you to be honest with me, not reassuring. I need to know what you actually think." He set the cup down, looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "I think Elder Marsh is a man who's been carrying something that's gotten too heavy for him, and when a man gets to that point, he either puts it down or he collapses under it. I think he'll put it down." He paused. "I think Silas has spent years in this county making himself necessary to people, and there's a difference between people who are loyal to you and people who depend on you. Loyalty is hard to shake. Dependence shifts when a better arrangement presents itself. And which does Silas have?" "Mostly dependence," he said, "which means when the thing holding it together comes apart, it comes apart fast. And if he does something before that happens, if he moves against the boys, or he won't move against them publicly, that's the one thing that would turn people against him before we even open the ledgers." He was watching her steadily. Hurting children is the line even people who owe him would not cross with him. She pressed her thumb along the edge of the veil's blue stitching. "You sound very certain." "I'm not certain," he said. "I'm making the best read I can with what I know." A pause. "I've been wrong before about people. I was wrong about—" He stopped. Started again. "When my sister got involved with Clara's father, I told her I had a bad feeling. She didn't want to hear it. I let it go because I didn't want to damage things between us." He looked at his hands on the table. "I'm not telling you that so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I want you to understand I know what it costs to be wrong about someone when the stakes are personal." She looked at him. His face in the lamplight was tired in the way that had nothing to do with ranch work. The deeper tiredness of someone who carried old regrets alongside new worries, the way most people did, in ways that didn't show unless you were paying attention. "You're not Silas," she said. "You could have been. You had, when I arrived here, you had every legal and social cover to be as bad as he is. He arranged this marriage. You could have treated me the way he implied I'd be treated." She kept her eyes on his face. "You didn't." "That's a low bar," he said, "not being cruel. It shouldn't be, but it is." She folded the veil back into its paper. I know what tomorrow might cost. I'm not walking into it blind. She stood up, and he stood too, the way he did, automatic and without performance. Whatever happens, I need you to know I'm not sorry I sent that letter to Marsh. Even if it goes wrong, even if Silas... She stopped. I need to be able to say we tried, that we didn't leave my mother's name under all of that because it was easier. Ronan looked at her for a long moment. We're not going to leave it there, he said. It wasn't a promise so much as a statement of intent. The way he said most things, as if uncertainty were a condition to be worked within rather than waited out. She had come in these weeks to find that quality more steadying than any reassurance would have been. Good night, she said. Good night, Elena. She went upstairs. She did not sleep well, but she slept. The community gathering was held in and around the Caldwell Creek Meeting Hall, a large weathered building at the center of town that served as the civic heart of 3 counties for one Saturday every summer. Families came from as far as 40 miles away. Tables were set up outside. Children ran loose in the field behind the building. The older men gathered near the fences and talked about rainfall and cattle prices, and the women organized the food with the brisk efficiency of people who'd been doing this long enough that the logistics were muscle memory. Elena had never been to the Caldwell Creek gathering as anything but a shadow. As the disgraced Ashcroft girl, or later as Silas Granger's ward, she'd attended twice and spent both times making herself small near the edges. Today she arrived in the wagon with Ronan and Clara and Rosa, and she sat straight on the bench and kept her hands folded and looked at the town as they rolled in, and the town looked back. She felt the shift even before they stopped, the particular quality of attention a place gives to something it's been talking about. A few people looked away too quickly. A few held the look a beat too long. One woman she didn't recognize leaned toward another and said something behind her hand. Rosa, sitting in the back with Clara, said quietly, "Don't look at them." "I'm not," Elena said. She wasn't. She was looking straight ahead. They set up at a table near the east side of the hall, and Clara immediately disappeared with Rosa to find the pie competition display, which Clara approached annually with the seriousness of a professional critic. Pete stayed with the wagon. Ronan stood beside Elena and let the morning come to them rather than chasing it. She saw Silas within 20 minutes. He was across the field, talking to a cluster of men near the fence line, the county recorder, she thought, and 2 men she recognized as having large property holdings north of town. He was in his good suit, the dark gray one he wore for events where he needed to look like a man of substance. He hadn't seen her yet, or was choosing not to show that he had. Then he turned and looked directly at her and smiled. The smile she knew, flat, contained, carrying its specific meaning without anyone else being able to read it. I know things you don't know, I know. I've already arranged things. You're still behind. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. She counted, and then looked away. He's already worked the room, she said quietly. Beside her, Ronan made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal. Elder Marsh is by the hall entrance, he said. He got here early. He has the ledgers with him. She hadn't seen that yet. She looked carefully, and yes, Elder Marsh stood near the hall entrance in his good coat, a leather satchel at his feet, talking to the county magistrate. His posture was the posture of someone who had made a decision and was now committed to it, the shoulders back slightly, the chin up. Okay, she said. The word came out steadier than she felt. The morning moved the way mornings at gatherings moved, slowly, socially, with many small conversations that seemed to be about food and weather and were actually about other things entirely. Several people spoke to Ronan in the easy way of men who respected each other. A few women came to introduce themselves to Elena with the cautious friendliness of people who were reserving judgment but didn't want to be caught on the wrong side of it if things shifted. One woman, Margaret Hollis, wife of the county recorder, held Elena's hand a moment after shaking it and said very quietly, "Your mother was kind to me once when I was new here. I haven't forgotten it." Then she moved on without waiting for a response, which was either social grace or a desire not to be seen doing it, and Elena was not going to spend time being resentful of a small kindness offered cautiously. It was near noon when it happened. Silas moved to the center of the gathering with the practiced ease of a man who had done this many times, created the conditions for his own audience without appearing to summon one. He simply started talking to the right people in a voice pitched to carry, and the natural gravity of a confident man speaking in a public space did the rest. Heads turned, conversations paused. A loose crowd formed without quite being asked to. Elena was 30 feet away when she heard him say her name. What I find most disappointing, Silas was saying, with the measured sadness of a man reluctantly telling an uncomfortable truth, is that the girl was given every advantage, every opportunity to make something honest of her situation. Her mother, God rest her, struggled with certain weaknesses of character that the family carried. I hoped Elena might be different. I tried to ensure that. He paused, let the pause do its work. But when a person goes looking to rewrite their own history rather than face it, when they start making accusations against those who've done nothing but help them, that's a lie. The voice surprised even her. She hadn't planned to say it, or at least she hadn't planned to say it in quite that way, in that tone, loud enough to stop his sentence in the middle of it. But there it was. The crowd shifted. The space between her and Silas suddenly felt very visible. He turned to her with that perfect, patient expression. "Elena," he said, the way you'd speak to a child mid-tantrum. "I understand you're upset. My mother paid back every cent of that debt," she said. Her voice was even. She was slightly surprised by that. She did it 4 months after the deficit was recorded. Cash donation, charity fund repayment, margin noted MA in the general fund ledger from that period, which exists, which is here today. She held Silas's gaze. She spent the rest of her life ashamed of something she'd already fixed, because someone made sure the repayment was buried where the community summary wouldn't reflect it. The crowd was very quiet now. Silas smiled. "I don't know where you've gotten that story, but the ledgers are here," Elder Marsh said. He'd moved from the hall entrance without Elena noticing, the leather satchel now open, one of the ledger books in his hands. He was not a physically imposing man, Elder Marsh, but the authority in his voice came from something older than size, the authority of a man confessing something publicly, which was its own kind of power. "I should have examined these records years ago," he said. "I did not. That is my failure, and I won't explain it away." He opened the ledger to the marked page and held it up, not theatrically, just plainly. "This is a thing that exists. The repayment is documented. The misrouting is documented. The connection between that misrouting and the continued public record of a debt that had been cleared." He stopped. "I'm not making a legal judgment here. I'm showing what I found in records that were in my care." The silence in the crowd had changed texture. It was no longer the silence of people watching a spectacle. It was the silence of people recalculating. Silas's smile stayed in place, but it was working harder now. "One ledger entry," he said, his voice still steady, still reasonable. "Decades of service to this community, and the county land office has been reviewing the guardianship accounts," Ronan said. He'd moved to stand beside Elena, not in front of her, beside her. "At my request, the discrepancy between what was claimed as outstanding debt and what the church records show isn't small. You have no authority to—" "I'm her husband," Ronan said, simply, flatly, with no decoration. "I have standing, and I asked." Something moved through Silas's face then, underneath the suit and the practiced patience. Something quick and ugly that was gone almost before it arrived. He turned back to the crowd, instinctive, reaching for the thing that had always worked. The audience, the witnesses, the community that had been his instrument for so long. "People in this town know me," he said. "They know what I've built here, what I've contributed. One, where are Thomas and William?" Elena said it before she knew she was going to say it. The question came from somewhere below conscious thought, the part of her that had been tracking this the whole time, the part that had counted exits and monitored dangers for 6 years. Silas paused. One beat too long. "The boys are at the house," he said. "Who's with them?" "My housekeeper. Elena, this is—" "Who specifically?" she said. And there it was. Something shifted in the crowd again. Not dramatically, not with anyone saying anything, but the subtle recalibration of people who had been watching a man manage a situation and had just seen him not manage it. A moment of too much pause, a question about children that shouldn't have been complicated. Ronan turned to Pete, who had materialized somewhere behind them, and said one quiet sentence. Pete disappeared. "The boys are fine," Silas said, recovering. his voice going slightly harder at the edges in a way that was new. In public, she'd never heard him let that edge show before. "Elena, you are making a scene based on— You took our mother's money," she said. She was not yelling. She would not yell. She kept her voice even and factual and looked at him directly. "You buried her repayment. You used the debt you invented to control me and my brothers for 6 years. And you will stand here today and say it to my face, or you will not. But either way, it will be in these records, and it will be in the county review, and it will be in this room full of people who are now going to know." The crowd around them had grown. She was aware of it the way you're aware of weather, not looking directly at it, but sensing the size and pressure of it. Silas looked at her. The smile was gone. What was underneath it was not pleasant, but it was at least honest. The face of a man who had run out of the right performance for the moment and hadn't yet found the next one. Then the sky went green. It happened fast, the way summer storms in Texas could happen. One moment blue sky with high clouds, and then a color change that any person who'd lived through one recognized instantly. Someone near the outer edge of the crowd said something low and urgent. Heads turned upward. The wind, which had been still all morning, came sideways and hard enough to knock a stack of pie plates off the nearest table with a crash that made everyone flinch. "Storm," someone said unnecessarily. What had been a crowd became a collection of people with immediate practical concerns. Food to get inside, children to account for, horses to secure. The neat social geometry of the gathering dissolved into movement. Rosa appeared from somewhere with Clara pressed against her side. Clara's expression combining alarm at the weather with what appeared to be strong feelings about the interrupted pie display. Silas moved, not toward Elena, not toward Elder Marsh. He turned and walked fast through the scattering crowd, heading toward the back of the hall, and Elena tracked him with her eyes and felt the particular cold clarity of understanding what was happening before it happened. "Ronan," she said. He was already moving, had clocked it the same moment she did, but the crowd was between them and Silas, and the wind had gotten serious now, a full rolling wall of it coming off the plains, with the kind of pressure that pushed people sideways, and by the time they got through the press of bodies to the back of the hall, Silas was gone. "Where's Pete?" Elena asked. Her voice was very controlled. "He went for the boys." A man came around this corner of the hall at a half run, one of the younger ranch hands from a neighboring property, and grabbed Ronan's arm. "Schoolhouse," he said, out of breath. "Back structure's going. Granger was seen near the support post not 10 minutes ago." The schoolhouse, Caldwell Creek's half-finished new building. Frame up but not yet enclosed, the lumber stacked and the walls only partly raised, sat at the north end of town. Elena was running before she'd consciously decided to run, and Ronan was beside her, and the wind came at them with grit and debris and the particular roar that meant the storm was not waiting for anyone's schedule. She heard the boys before she saw them. Will's voice, high and scared, calling her name from somewhere in the direction of the schoolhouse. She turned toward it and ran harder, and the world had gone that strange yellow-green that precedes the worst of it, and the first of the rain hit like thrown gravel, horizontal and cold. The schoolhouse frame was visibly wrong. Two of the main support posts on the east wall were leaning, not collapsed, not yet, but wrong, angled in a way that physics would correct shortly and not gently. Under the partial roof, two small figures stood pressed against the far wall. Thomas, 10 years old, had his arm around Will's shoulders and his face toward Elena with an expression she had never in her life wanted to see on her brother's face. Silas was there too. He was standing inside the frame, between Elena and the boys, and he had Will's wrist in his hand, not violently, carefully, the way you hold something you intend to use. His face had gone past the gathered crowd version of himself entirely. What was left was simpler and more honest and considerably more frightening. "You should have taken the offer," he said to Ronan, who had come up beside Elena. His voice was almost conversational, which was the worst part. "I was willing to settle this quietly." "Let go of him," Elena said. "The debt is real," Silas said. "Your mother's name, your arrangement, all of it. Whatever Marsh thinks he found in those boxes, I have documentation of my own. I've been building this county for 20 years. You think one ledger?" The east support post shifted. It made a sound, a slow, grinding complaint of stressed lumber. And everyone in the frame looked at it simultaneously, the way animals look at a sound in the dark. Silas's grip on Will's wrist loosened by a fraction. It was enough. Will wrenched sideways, small and fast the way 8-year-olds could be, and stumbled toward Elena, and she caught him and held on. Thomas was already moving, scrambling around the far edge of the leaning post, and Ronan went in for him. And the post shifted again, more this time, and Elena had both her brothers, and she was moving backward out of the frame, and the wind hit them all like a wall, and the rain came down in full force now, no longer gravel but water, real water, the kind that soaked through everything instantly and turned the ground to mud underfoot. The east wall of the schoolhouse came down not with a crash, but with a series of sounds, cracks, a long groan, the percussion of heavy lumber hitting the frame, and the frame hitting the ground. A sequence that lasted maybe 4 seconds and felt much longer. Silas ran, not toward town, into the storm, away from the gathering, away from the ledgers and the crowd and the county records, away from the thing that was already done even if he couldn't fully see it yet. Ronan let him go. Elena stood in the rain with both her brothers, one arm around each of them, Will shaking against her side and Thomas trying very hard not to shake, and watched Ronan watch Silas disappear into the gray wall of the storm. She saw the moment Ronan made the decision, saw it in his shoulders and his jaw, the decision to not chase, not yet, not while the boys were here and the structure behind them was still settling. He turned back to them. His face was wet and his expression was the kind of tired that had nothing to do with physical exertion. "Are you hurt?" he asked the boys, addressed to both of them, direct, no fussing. "No, sir," Thomas said. His voice was only slightly unsteady. Will looked up at Elena. "He said we were coming to see you," he said. The specific wrongness of the situation was still catching up to him. "He said you wanted us to come today." "I know," Elena said. She pulled him tighter. "I know, it's okay." It was not entirely okay. Nothing about the last 20 minutes had been okay. But he was here. Both of them were here. And the thing she had been keeping at bay for 10 days, longer, 6 years, longer than that, cracked open somewhere in her chest and she stood in the rain holding her brothers and let it. The storm moved through and passed the way those storms did, fast and absolute, leaving behind the particular clarity of washed air and damaged things. The gathering had dispersed into the hall, and as the rain eased, people came back out to find the community they'd been part of an hour ago rearranged into something different. Different conversations, different alignments. The thing that had been said in the open air before the storm hit, still hanging in the cooler air after. Elder Marsh was standing by the hall entrance when Elena came back, wet and mud-hemmed and still holding Will's hand. He had the ledger book in his arms, protected under his coat, dry. He looked at her and at the boys beside her, and something moved through his old face that she didn't try to name. "The records are intact," he said. "Good," she said. Rosa appeared with blankets and the complete absence of sentimentality that was her particular form of deep care, and Thomas submitted to being wrapped in one with the dignity of a boy who understood he had earned it. Claire was found inside the hall, dry, having apparently decided that the storm was no reason to abandon her assessment of the pie competition, which she delivered to Will with great authority while he dripped on the floor. Ronan came to stand beside Elena. He was as wet as she was, and he'd lost his hat somewhere in the chaos, and he looked, for the first time since she'd known him, genuinely undone. Not broken, not defeated, just human in a way that the ranch's daily requirements didn't usually leave room to show. "Pete sent word," he said. "Silas's horse has gone from the hitching post on the north side." "He's running," she said. "Yes." He looked toward the north end of town where the storm was moving away now, the sky behind it already lightening to something like ordinary afternoon. "He's running with whatever he had time to grab, which means he knows it's over." "Is it over?" He turned and looked at her. "The ledgers are in Marsh's hands, and there are 40 people in that hall who heard you say what you said and watched him not deny it." He paused. "The county review was already open. What happened today gives them everything they need to finish it." A beat. "For the boys, legally, yes, it's over." She looked at Thomas and Will, dry now and in the corner with Clara. Will apparently recovered enough to be explaining something to Clara with considerable hand gestures, while Thomas looked on with the long-suffering tolerance of an older brother. They were so ordinary, so entirely themselves. She had spent 6 years being afraid for them, and they were just Thomas and Will, her brothers, eating pie samples off Clara's plate and existing in the world with the uncomplicated physicality of children who didn't know yet how close it had been. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. Let it pass. The schoolhouse, she said. The east wall came down. The frame held mostly, repairable. She looked toward where it stood, visible from the hall doorway, the east wall down but the rest still standing. Someone would have to rebuild that section. Someone would have to go back in and do the work of making it right after it had been damaged by someone determined to use it as a weapon. She thought, we can do that. Not gracefully, not quickly, not without considerable argument about lumber grades from Pete and complaints from Clara about being bored, and at least one afternoon where everything seemed harder than it should be. But they could do it. She looked at Ronan, who was still standing beside her, hatless and wet, and the particular version of tired that she had come to understand was simply what he looked like when he stopped performing for anyone. Thank you, she said. He shook his head, starting the dismissive gesture. No, she said. Don't. She looked at him steadily. You could have stayed out of it. This wasn't your fight when I arrived here. It became mine, he said. Yes. She held his gaze. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone had started organizing the cleanup of the storm debris, and there was the sound of wood being moved and people calling to each other and the ordinary noise of a community dealing with the aftermath of weather. His jaw moved slightly, that thing he did when he was deciding how honest to be. Because I know what it costs to let something wrong keep being wrong, because it's easier than the alternative, he said finally. I learned it with Catherine. I didn't want to learn it again. She thought about Catherine's veil, folded in its brown paper on the kitchen table at the ranch, the blue stitches, repaired and holding, the damage you could make invisible if you were willing to do the slow, careful work of it. We should go home, she said, something in his face, very quiet. Yes, he said. We should. They gathered the children, all three of them now, Thomas and Will, added to the number without ceremony, as if this were already the arrangement they'd been moving toward, and found the wagon and loaded it, and Rosa organized everyone with the efficient authority of a woman who had never once in her life waited for chaos to finish before beginning to restore order. Pete drove. Elena sat between Will and Clara in the back, and Thomas sat up front with Pete asking questions about the horses, because Thomas had always been interested in horses. She'd forgotten that in the long months away from him. Ronan rode alongside on his own horse, not crowding the wagon, keeping pace. The road back to Blackstone Ranch ran through the valley with the Silver Creek, the same route she'd traveled on a spring morning months ago with a worn bag and a weight she hadn't known how to set down. The light was different now, afternoon light after a storm, golden and washed, the kind that made everything look slightly more real than usual. Will leaned against her side. He smelled like rain and hay and the specific smell of her brother, unchanged, exactly himself. Elena, he said. Is that man going to bother us anymore? She looked at the road, at the valley opening up ahead, at Ronan on his horse, the easy way he sat in the saddle, the particular shape of his shoulders against the cleaned sky. No, she said. He's not. Will was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Good, with the complete simplicity of a child who believed her, and put his head down on her arm. She let him. Silas Granger was found 3 days later. Not by Ronan, not by the county sheriff, not by anyone who'd been looking for him in any organized way. He was found by a farmer named Odell Pruitt, who ran cattle on the western edge of the county, a taciturn man who came into Caldwell Creek twice a year and had opinions about very little outside of beef prices and fence wire. Pruitt found Silas in the lean-to shelter on the back of his property, soaked through and feverish from 2 nights in the open after the storm, with mud on his good suit and stolen church money sewn into the lining of his coat. The money was the thing that finished it, not the ledgers, not the county review, not anything Elena had said in front of the community gathering. Those things had cracked the foundation, but it was the physical fact of a man running with charity money hidden in his clothing that collapsed it entirely. You could argue about ledger entries and misrouted donations and the interpretation of margin notations. You could not argue with cash in a coat lining when the man wearing the coat had just been publicly accused of stealing it. The county magistrate came to Blackstone Ranch on a Tuesday morning to take Elena's formal statement. He was a careful, methodical man named Aldous Reeves, who asked his questions without editorializing and wrote down the answers in precise, unhurried script. When he was done, he closed his notebook and looked at her across the kitchen table with the expression of a man who had been in his position long enough to have seen most varieties of human behavior. "The guardianship arrangement is dissolved as of this filing," he said. "Your brothers are released from it entirely. Any outstanding claims Granger made against your mother's estate are invalidated pending the full county review, which," he paused, "I expect will not take long, given the documentation Elder Marsh has provided." Elena sat with her hands flat on the table. She'd been doing that less lately, she'd noticed. The hands on the table thing. The bracing. She wasn't sure when it had started to ease, but it had. "And Silas?" she asked. "Criminal proceeding will be filed by the end of the week. Misappropriation of charitable funds is serious. The falsification of guardianship records compounds it significantly." Reeves picked up his notebook. "He'll have counsel, and he'll use it, and it will take time. But the outcome," he chose his next word with the care of a man who dealt in facts rather than promises. "The outcome seems fairly clear." After he left, Rosa put a cup of coffee in front of Elena and sat down across from her, which Rosa almost never did during the day. She sat with her own cup, and they drank in the particular silence that had developed between them over months. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people who had gotten past the need to fill every space. "Well," Rosa said finally. "Well," Elena agreed. Outside, she could hear Thomas and Will in the yard. They'd been at the ranch for 4 days now, folded into its rhythms with the adaptability of children who had been living in uncertainty long enough that stability, when it arrived, felt less like adjustment and more like relief. Thomas had attached himself to Pete with an intensity that Pete appeared to find both flattering and slightly alarming. Will had discovered the chickens and was conducting what he described as experiments in animal behavior, which mostly involved throwing feed at them in different patterns and observing the results. Clara had regarded both boys for the first full day with the measuring stare she reserved for anything new. Then, on the second morning, she had apparently reached her verdict, because she sat down next to Will at breakfast and began explaining the chickens to him with the authority of established expertise, and by afternoon the three of them were an operational unit that Rosa described, with grim accuracy, as a significant management challenge. Ronan watched all of it from a slight distance, in the way he did most things. Not uninvested, just careful not to crowd it. Elena had noticed that about him from early on, the way he gave things room to become what they were going to be rather than trying to accelerate them. She found him at the fence line of the east pasture that evening, doing the kind of end-of-day checks that were less about necessity and more about the rhythm of a man who needed an hour of quiet after a day of people. She came and stood beside him at the fence. Sage moved in the paddock nearby, unhurried. They stood there for a while without talking, which had also become something they did. The comfortable version of silence, the kind that didn't require managing. "Reeves came," she said. "I know, Pete told me. It's done. Legally, the guardianship is dissolved. Whatever comes next for Silas comes next, but the boys are free." Ronan nodded. He was looking at the cattle in the lower pasture, the last of the evening light going gold across the grass. "How do you feel?" It was a direct question, and he meant it directly, which she'd learned was how he asked most things. "Strange," she said honestly. "I keep waiting for something else to go wrong. Some other thing I haven't accounted for." She leaned her arms on the top fence rail. 6 years of accounting for everything. It's hard to stop." "It doesn't stop all at once," he said. "That kind of habit. It just gets quieter." She looked at him sideways. "Is that from experience?" "After Catherine died," he said. He paused. "I spent about 2 years walking into rooms and calculating what could go wrong in them. What Clara might fall off of, what could catch fire, who might leave." He looked out at the pasture. "Rosa kept telling me I was borrowing trouble. I thought she didn't understand." A pause. She understood. Elena thought about that, about the specific texture of carrying fear so long it starts to feel like practicality, like just being smart about the world, about the way Silas had trained her to stay small and watchful and always ready for the next bad thing. "My mother wasn't like that," she said. "She wasn't a worrier. She trusted people too quickly, maybe. She believed that if you did right by people, they'd do right by you. She stopped. Silas proved her wrong, and it killed her slowly. And the terrible thing is, I still think she was more right than wrong about people. I just think she ran into one specific person who was the exception. One person can do a lot of damage, Ronan said. Yes. She looked at the pasture. But so can one person going the other way. He was quiet. She hadn't been looking at him when she said it, but she felt him shift slightly, the way a person does when something lands in a place they weren't expecting. She pushed off from the fence rail. I want to go to Caldwell Creek tomorrow, she said, to see my mother's grave. I haven't been able to go. I know, he said. I'll come with you if you want, or Pete can drive you if you'd rather go with the boys. Both, she said. I want the boys there, and I want... She stopped and was honest about it. I don't want to go without you. He looked at her then, properly, the full attention way he had when something mattered. All right, he said. Tomorrow. She went back to the house. Behind her, she heard him stay at the fence a little longer, which was also something he did. Complete the things he'd started, close out the day properly before coming inside. She had stopped finding it strange. She had started finding it, actually, a quality she respected. The grave was in the Caldwell Creek Cemetery, which sat on a small hill at the east edge of town, surrounded by cedar trees that were older than the town itself. Elena's mother had been buried there with the minimum of ceremony that attended someone whose reputation had already been decided. The stone was small, plain granite, the dates and name correct and nothing else, because Elena had been 16 and had no money and no authority to commission anything more. She stood in front of it on a Wednesday morning with Thomas on her left and Will on her right, and Ronan a few steps back, giving them the space that was theirs. The cemetery was empty except for them. The cedars moved in the morning wind. Will read the stone carefully. He'd been working hard on his reading this year, Elena knew from the letters. Will had always found it harder than Thomas, and was stubborn about the effort in a way she found deeply familiar. He read the name and the dates and then looked up at Elena. She looks younger than I thought she'd be, he said. In the dates? She was, Elena said. Thomas put his hands in his pockets. He had their mother's eyes, the particular gray-green that Elena always forgot until she saw it. Do you think she knows? He asked, not looking at Elena, looking at the stone. About what happened? What you found. Elena thought about that. She thought about what she actually believed, rather than what she was supposed to say. I don't know, she said honestly. I think... She stopped. I think it matters that we know, and that we said it out loud where people could hear it. She looked at her mother's name on the stone. Margaret Ashcroft. She was honest. She did what was right even when it cost her everything, and nobody saw it, and that was a wrong that needed correcting. She looked at her brothers. We corrected it. Maybe that's what we can give her. Thomas nodded. Will reached out and touched the stone once, briefly, with 2 fingers, and then put his hand back in his pocket. They stood there a while. Nobody said anything else that needed to be said. On the way back through town, Elena stopped at the Caldwell Creek dry goods store for a few things Rosa needed, and the woman behind the counter, a woman named Hester, whom Elena had known peripherally for years, who had never once gone out of her way to speak to her, looked at her as she set the items on the counter and said, carefully but directly, "What you said at the gathering about your mother, I should have thought harder about things years ago. I didn't. I'm sorry for it." Elena looked at her. Hester was maybe 50, with the weathered face of a woman who worked hard and slept honestly and probably wasn't comfortable with what she was saying right now. That discomfort was visible, and it was real. "Thank you for saying it," Elena said. She paid for the items and carried them out, and she didn't feel the way she thought she'd feel. Not triumphant, not particularly vindicated, just tired and sad, and aware that apologies from people who should have done better years ago were complicated things that were both worth having and not quite enough. But they were something, and something was not nothing. The work on the schoolhouse began the following Monday. It had been Ronan's idea originally, but Elena was the one who made it concrete. She sat down with him on Sunday evening and said, "Before anything else, before we talk about anything else, I want to fix the schoolhouse." She looked at him steadily. "Not because it's practical, though it is, because Silas used it as a weapon and I want it to be something else. Ronan had looked at her for a moment and then said, Monday. And that was the extent of the discussion. He organized the labor, 2 of his own ranch hands, Pete, and 4 men from neighboring properties who showed up Monday morning with tools and no particular explanation for their presence, which Elena understood was its own kind of statement. The county recorder's son came. Elder Marsh sent 2 of the younger men from the community. By mid-morning, there were 11 people working on the east wall of the schoolhouse, which was both more than necessary and not a thing Elena was going to argue about. Thomas wanted to help and was allowed to carry lumber under supervision. Will wanted to help and was redirected by Rosa toward a project involving the organization of tools that was clearly invented on the spot, but which Will approached with complete seriousness. Clara sat on a nearby fence post and offered architectural opinions that nobody asked for and which were occasionally, irritatingly, correct. Elena worked alongside the men. She'd learned enough about construction from the barn roof to be useful rather than decorative about it, and she could tell that a few of the men had arrived expecting to manage her helpfulness diplomatically and were quietly recalibrating. She didn't make a point of it. She just worked. By Wednesday, the east wall was rebuilt. Not finished. The roof was still partially open and the windows weren't in yet. But structurally sound, the damage undone, the building standing the way it was supposed to stand. She was standing inside the frame late on Wednesday afternoon, alone for once, everyone else packed up and gone for the day. The light came through the open roof at a long afternoon angle, falling across the fresh lumber smell of new wood and sawdust. She could see where the old damage had been by the slight color difference in the timber, new against weathered, obvious if you knew to look. She thought about the veil, about the color difference in the thread where new stitching met old, the way repair always left a mark if you looked closely enough, the way that mark was not failure, but evidence that something had been broken and someone had decided it was worth the work. She heard footsteps and turned. Ronan came through the open doorway, hat in hand, the same way she'd first seen him on the porch at Blackstone Ranch, turning it over twice before stopping. 4 months ago. It felt like a different version of the world. Rosa's asking about supper, he said. I'm coming. But she didn't move yet. She looked at the new timber in the east wall. It's good work. It is. He looked at it too. It'll be a good school. When they finish it properly. When they finish it. He turned the hat over, set it back on his head. Elena. The way he said her name had shifted, she'd noticed, somewhere in the past weeks. Not dramatically, just differently, with a small, deliberate weight to it, like he was paying attention to the fact of it. I told you when you arrived that after a year, if you wanted to leave, I'd give you enough money to go somewhere Granger couldn't reach you. He looked at her, not away, not at the wall. That offer stands. It will always stand. I want you to know that. He paused. I also want you to know that I'm not, that what's happened here between the ranch and the boys and all of it, I didn't plan any of it as a way to... He stopped, made himself start over. I'm not good at this, he said. Saying things directly about things that matter to me. I manage all right with cattle and fences, and I'm terrible at this. You're not terrible at it, she said. You're just slow. The corner of his mouth moved. Yes. She looked at him. At the man who had given her a room and a lamp and 20 minutes alone and hadn't asked for anything in return. Who had sat on a porch in the dark and listened to her tell him about her mother. Who had ridden to see Elder Marsh and written to the county land office and stood beside her at the gathering. Beside her, not in front of her, and she understood now how much that distinction had meant. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I know you said that before. I'm saying it again. She held his gaze. Not because of the boys, not because of the arrangement, not because I don't have options. I'm saying it because I'm choosing to say it. She paused. There's a difference. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. There is. I'd like to be asked properly, she said. When you're ready. Not because of any arrangement or debt or practical reason, just asked. Something in his face went very still, and then settled into something she hadn't seen on it before. Something uncomplicated and open. The expression of a man who'd stopped calculating for a moment and was simply present in a room. I can do that, he said. Good. She looked at the new timber one more time. Then she moved toward the doorway, toward the afternoon outside, toward the wagon and the road home, and Rosa's supper and 3 children who were probably currently engaged in something that would require explanation. She stopped at the doorway and looked back. Ronan. Yeah. Thank you for all of it. She met his eyes. I know you think that doesn't require thanks, but I needed to say it clearly so that you'd have it. So you'd know. He held her gaze, nodded once, not dismissively this time, receiving it, actually, the way she'd meant it. She went out into the afternoon. The completed schoolhouse opened 6 weeks later, on a September morning when the worst of the summer heat had finally broken and the air had the first tentative suggestion of fall in it. The east wall stood straight and solid, the roof was on, the windows were in, and someone, Elena still didn't know who, had painted the door frame a deep, clean blue. It was a small ceremony. Elder Marsh said a few words. The county recorder made some remarks about the community's future that were sincere if slightly long. The children who would attend came with their parents and stood in the new morning light and fidgeted with the controlled energy of people who had been told to behave. Clara attended in her best dress, which she had already managed to get a grass stain on, and stood with Thomas and Will in a loose confederation that had developed its own internal logic over weeks. Clara's precision and Thomas's steadiness and Will's chaotic optimism somehow forming something that functioned better than it had any structural reason to. Elena stood near the back of the gathered crowd, not because she was hiding, but because she wanted to see it whole. The building, the people in front of it, the blue door frame. Rosa appeared beside her. Stop looking at it like you're waiting for something to go wrong, she said, without looking at her. I'm not. You are. You've been doing it for a month. Rosa crossed her arms. It's a schoolhouse. It's standing. It's going to keep standing. Elena almost smiled. I know. Your mother would have wanted to see this, Rosa said, plainly, without sentiment as performance. A school for all these children. She would have liked it. Elena looked at the blue door frame, at the morning light on the new timber, at her brothers who were arguing about something with Clara in the low-key, continuous way they argued about most things, which meant they were comfortable, which meant they were all right. Yes, she said, she would have. After the ceremony, when the crowd was dispersing into the morning and children were being redirected from climbing the fence, and someone had produced a quantity of food that suggested considerable advanced planning, Elena went inside the empty schoolroom. It smelled like fresh lumber and new plaster and the particular cleanness of a space not yet lived in. The morning light came through the east windows, the new windows, the ones that hadn't been there before the east wall came down, and laid itself across the bare floor in long rectangles. She had the veil with her. She'd brought it from the ranch that morning without quite articulating to herself why until she was standing in the schoolroom with it in her hands. The ivory fabric, the repaired blue stitching, the place where new thread met old if you looked closely enough. There was a window above the teacher's desk, east-facing, catching the morning light at its best angle. She stood on the chair and hung the veil over the upper portion of it, the way you'd hang a curtain, the blue stitching catching the light. It didn't cover the window fully. It wasn't meant to. It let the light through, the fabric making the morning sun softer and more diffuse, casting a faint pattern on the floor below. Not quite a shadow and not quite color, something in between. She climbed down from the chair and stood back and looked at it. The door opened behind her. She turned. Ronan stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, looking at the veil in the window, and then at her. Rosa told me you'd be in here, he said. It seemed right, she said. For the school. It seemed like Catherine made it for something that mattered. This matters. He looked at the veil for a long moment, at his sister's work, in the light of a building that had been broken and rebuilt. She watched something move through his face. Grief, yes. Still, you didn't stop grieving in 6 months. But underneath it, or alongside it, something else. Something that looked like peace having a complicated conversation with itself. She would have thought it was a good idea, he said finally. Would she have told me so? Loudly, he said, at length, with commentary on the color choice. Elena looked at the light coming through the ivory fabric. What would she have said about me? He considered it honestly, the way he did most things. She would have said you were stubborn, he said. She would have meant it as a compliment. A pause. She would have told me not to ruin it. And what would you have said to that? He turned the hat over in his hands, looked at her, not away, with the full attention steadiness that she had come to understand was simply how he was when something mattered to him enough to stop performing around it. I would have told her I was working on it, he said. Outside, she could hear Clara's voice at full volume explaining something to Will that Will was resisting on principle. She could hear Thomas's laughter, which was lower than she remembered and meant he was growing again. She could hear Rosa telling someone that the food wasn't going to organize itself, which meant Rosa was happy because Rosa only gave instructions when she was invested in the outcome. The morning light moved through Catherine's veil and fell across the schoolroom floor, and Elena Ashcroft stood in it and thought about her mother, who had done right by people in a world that hadn't done right by her, who had paid a debt she didn't owe and been given shame instead of credit for it, who had raised her daughter to be careful and precise and good at mending things, and who could not have known, sitting at a kitchen table, teaching a young girl to darn and stitch and make damaged things whole again, that she was teaching her how to survive. Some lessons don't announce themselves as lessons. They just live in your hands until you need them. She thought about choices. The ones made for you, the ones made under duress, the ones that feel like choices but are really just the least terrible option available. She thought about what it felt like to make one that was actually, genuinely, freely yours. The strange weight of it, the strange lightness. She had not fixed her life. She had not fixed the world. Silas Granger was in a county proceeding that would grind through its slow institutional process for months, and there would be days of testimony and documentation and the particular ugliness of watching a man fight to keep what he'd built out of other people's suffering. Her mother's name would be cleared on paper, and the town would move on, and some people would remember and some would conveniently forget, and that was just the nature of communities and people, and how things actually worked rather than how you wished they did. Thomas would have nightmares for a while. Will would break things. Clara would have opinions. Rosa would have stronger opinions. Pete would say very little about most of it and be quietly indispensable throughout. And Ronan Blackstone would stand in doorways, giving things room to become what they were going to be. And one day, not today, not in this moment, but one day, he was going to ask her something directly, and she was going to answer him directly, and they were going to build something together that was going to be imperfect and sometimes hard, and not the life either of them had planned, and probably the truest thing either of them had ever had. She looked at the light through the veil one more time. Then she walked toward the door. "Come on," she said. "Rosa will actually come in here and collect us if we don't go out." "She's done it before," Ronan said. He held the door for her. She walked out into the September morning, into the noise and the light and the people, into the life that was, finally, after everything, her own. She didn't look back. She didn't need to.